A solitary owl hooted in the distance as the old Lantern Inn stood bathed in the pale silver glow of the autumn moon. The cold wind howled through the village lanes, rattling shutters and sending dry leaves skittering across cobbled streets like whispers of unseen ghosts. Inside, the warmth of gaslight flickered over a cozy common room where 5 figures sat in the comfort of familiarity. It was a ritual. The Friday night club, a small circle of inquisitive minds who found joy in unraveling the mundane mysteries of their quiet town. But tonight, the mystery would not be trivial. Tonight, the old Lantern Inn would become the stage for something far more sinister. Agatha Marple, a woman of keen observation and quiet authority, lifted her teacup with deliberate grace. Though not physically imposing, there was an air about her that made people listen when she spoke. Dressed in her signature grey tweed jacket and skirt, her eyes, sharp as a falcon's, swept across the room, absorbing the nuances of every movement and murmur. Around her, the others of the club enjoyed the remnants of Margaret Carter's renowned scones, their soft voices blending with the crackle of the fireplace. The old Lantern Inn itself had history woven into its very walls. Once a hunting lodge of nobility, its grandeur had faded into a nostalgic opulence. The high-beamed ceiling, carved with mythical creatures, loomed overhead, while the dark oak paneling gleamed under the dim glow of the lamps. Heavy drapes, embroidered with intricate patterns, billowed slightly as the wind pressed against the mullioned windows. There was something about the place tonight, something different, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Then, it happened. The door swung open with force, colliding against the wooden paneling with a sharp bang. The effect was instantaneous. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned. Margaret Carter stood in the doorway, her face pale as a ghost, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. One hand gripped the doorframe, as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her usually pristine blue frock was wrinkled, as if she had been clutching at it in distress. Agatha was the first to react. She set down her cup with precise calm, her eyes locking onto Margaret's trembling frame. "My dear Margaret," she said, her voice laced with both concern and curiosity. "What is it?" Margaret took a breath, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to find the words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she uttered 2 chilling words. "It's gone." A ripple of unease swept through the room. "What's gone?" Lucy Spencer, the young journalist with a sharp mind and a sharper pen, leaned forward. Margaret swallowed hard. "My recipe book, stolen from the storeroom." Silence. Then, as if on cue, a murmur of disbelief and speculation erupted. Margaret's prized recipe book was no ordinary collection of culinary notes. It was a closely guarded treasure, passed down through generations, containing secret formulas that had won her countless accolades. More than that, it was the heart of the inn's reputation, especially with the upcoming Dunford Harvest Festival, where the grand prize was not just prestige, but a hefty sum of money. Agatha's fingers tapped against the porcelain rim of her cup, as her mind clicked into motion. A locked storeroom, a missing book, a desperate owner. The pieces were already forming a puzzle, and she, for one, was more than eager to solve it. "Locked, you say?" Agatha's voice was thoughtful, measured. Margaret nodded. "Yes. I always keep it locked. And yet, someone got in." Dr. Brooks, the genial physician, adjusted his spectacles. Then whoever took it had access to a key, or they found another way in. The wind howled against the window, the lamplight flickering ominously. Outside, the village slumbered, unaware that within these very walls, a thief lurked in the shadows. A thief who had dared to steal the lifeblood of the old Lantern Inn. And Agatha Marple had every intention of finding out who it was. "I found this." She held up a small slip of paper, corners crumpled by her trembling grasp. Agatha rose and stepped forward politely, taking the note. The rest of the Friday night club peered around her shoulders, straining to see the paper, bore only a few scrolled words. "You won't be winning this time." A taut silence choked the room. broken only by the hiss of the fireplace. At last Martin Lowe, a reserved fellow rumored to have served in military intelligence, murmured, "Who would do such a thing? Surely the bake-off can't be so cut-throat." "But it is," Dr. Brooks interjected, quietly, a troubled furrow on his brow. "A decent prize, not to mention the prestige for any bakery or household, and Margaret's recipes are quite famous." Margaret drew in a wavering breath. I haven't touched a thing in the storeroom. Beyond seeing the damage to the cabinet, I came straight here while the others bombarded Margaret with questions." Agatha Marple quietly walked to the half the note still in her hand. She studied the coarse scroll of the message, as though the shape of each letter might yield a secret. Her calm was notable even among a group that prided itself on rational mind. She glanced at the door. Margaret had left ajar. The corridor beyond seemed to deepen into shadow as though ushering in fresh uncertainties. At last, she turned back, tucking the note into an inner pocket of her jacket with careful deliberation. "Margaret," she said, her tone crisp and measured, "please take us to the storeroom, best to see for ourselves before any further commotion spreads. If a crime has indeed been committed, we must act quickly and discreetly." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with a fearful sort of gratitude, while the doctor placed a steadying hand on her elbow. Lucy cast a quick darting look at Agatha, half in awe of the other woman's composure. Martin Lowe, toying with the watch on his wrist, said nothing, though his gaze flickered with the sharp interest of a man accustomed to unraveling complexities in a quiet huddle. The Friday night club followed Margaret out of the snug common room. The corridor's parrot floors creaked underfoot, lit only by the glow of a single electric lamp that accentuated the age of the lodge turned in. Then faint perfume of baking bread mixed incongruously with the tang of dust, and feather footsteps slowed as the storeroom door came into sight. Erga lock splintered. A sense of sudden foreboding clung to the air like a winter frost. Within moments they would behold the wreckage, an upturned container of salt or flour perhaps scattered across the storeroom floor, evidence of a forced entry, the absence of that precious leather-bound book upon which Margaret Carter's livelihood so often relied. The question of why and who would loom in the minds of these villages, each with their own secrets, flaws and quiet ambitions. For now, though the group paused on the threshold, as if unwilling to bring the gravity of the situation fully into their midst, Agatha Marple stepped forward, her calmness a gentle anchor in the swirling tide of suspicion and fear. It was a look that promised thoroughness and impartiality, a methodical approach to unveiling truths. No one spoke, for there was nothing to say. A theft in Dunford, especially involving Margaret Carter, was serious business indeed. As the lamp on the wall flickered, casting curious shadows across troubled faces, it seemed the comfortable walls of the old Lantern Inn had grown close and watchful, as themselves unwilling participants in the unfolding mystery. And so in the dying glow of that autumn night, the crime at the old Lantern Inn was discovered, daring, disruptive, and certain to challenge the delicate facade of contentment that Dunford prided itself upon. Even then Agatha Marple's keen mind was already sifting through the scene, quietly assembling the puzzle in her mind. Peace. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the diamond paint windows of the old Leld, illuminating a haze of dust motes in the still warm air. Although autumn had begun to strip the oaks and maples of their foliage inside the inn, the scent of sweet pastries and strong tea lent a cozy contrast. Patches of polished floorboards reflected the remnants of daylight, and heavy brocade curtains lent an oddly claustrophobic opulence to what had once been a lordly hunting lodge. At a walnut table near the old stone hearth sat 5 individuals, the Friday night club, who had lingered well past their weekly discussion. Chief among them was Agatha Marple, a woman of quiet composure in her early 60s, wearing a sensible tweed jacket and skirt. Mild grey eyes and neat silver hair gave little away, yet she possessed a penetrating intelligence all the more formidable for its polite subtlety. They were half in conversation, half listening to the gentle crackle of the fire when Margaret Carter, proprietor of the old Lantern Inn, hurried into the room. Her face ashen. "It's gone," she cried, setting a trembling hand to her chest. "My recipe book. Someone has stolen it." That statement shattered the tranquil hush. Lucy Spencer, a spirited young journalist, sprang up at once, nearly upsetting her teacup. "Stolen?" she echoed. "Surely there must be some mistake." But Margaret, eyes glistening with panic, shook her head vehemently. "I'm certain the cupboard was forced open, my notes and supplies all in disarray." At these words, Dr. Edwin Brooks, a jovial physician with a kindly but inquisitive manner, set aside his saucer and rose from his seat. "My dear Margaret," he said, his low voice attempting to soothe, "try to catch your breath and tell us precisely what you found." Margaret drew in a shuddering breath and clasped her apron in both hands. "I went to fetch my recipe book to finalize preparations for the Dunford Harvest Festival bake-off, only days away. As you know, when I reached the store, I noticed the lock on my spice cabinet had been tampered with. At first I thought it must be a trick of the light. But then," her gaze flickered around the group as if struggling to maintain composure, "everything was in chaos. My notes, my recipes for the competition gone, and the sparing ingredients I'd meticulously set aside were covered in salt from a toppled kista, utterly ruined." From her corner of the table, Agatha Marple pressed her lips together thoughtfully, her eyes cool and assessing, passed over Margaret, then flitted to the open doorway behind the innkeeper. In that corridor lay the storeroom, now evidently the heart of a crime. Lucy stepped closer to Margaret, laying a sympathetic hand on her arm. "But why? Who would do such a thing?" Martin Lowe, a reserve man rumored to have served in discreet government work during the war, cleared his throat. "The Vove does bring some measure of fame, and the winner's chosen charity stands to receive a sizable donation if Margaret's recipe book is as valuable as everyone says." Margaret's face, already pale, turned paler. "Yet I've been runner-up before, but many times I win, and the donation is especially dear this year." She paused, uncertain how much to divulge. "I had a personal stake in ensuring a particular cause received the money. Whoever took that book knew exactly what they were doing." A hush fell, broken only by the popping of logs in the fireplace. The air felt thick with both indignation and apprehension, as if the heavy drapes had tightened the walls around them. Dr. Brooks spoke again, glancing discreetly toward Agatha. "Shall we see the storeroom? I imagine our Agatha might glean something from the scene." Margaret hesitated, her anxious eyes scanning the group. Then she nodded quickly, half in resignation, half in hope. "Please, yes. I don't know what to do. The back-off is days away, my best recipe." Agatha Marple rose in a smooth, unhurried fashion, though unassuming. In her manner there was a quiet assurance about her that calmed Margaret somewhat. "Show us." "My dear," she said kindly, "we will do what we can together." They made their way to the corridor. The transition from the inviting common room to the darker hall was stark. Gilded sconces, tarnished from decades of use, provided scant illumination, revealing cracks in the paneling like the lines of a careworn face. The storeroom door stood half open, the lock clearly splintered around the brass latch. Inside, the air smelled of spices and subtle dismay. A shallow pool of spilled salt glittered under the warm light, a mocking sign of the sabotage. The shelves of jars, cardamom, cloves, cinnamon looked jostled as though rummaged in haste. Agatha noted too that the floor near the far wall bore footprints in the salt, each impression blurred and overlapping, pointing to more than one pass made through the chaos. "Such thorough vandalism," Lucy murmured, her voice subdued. "It looks deliberate. Someone wanted to destroy as much as they could." Margaret pressed her lips together, then took a faltering step forward. "They took my best brandy for the fruit cake and my brand new canister of sugar. I only hope they didn't get my notes on the spicing ratios." Agatha Marple laid a gentle hand on Margaret's forearm. "Have courage, Margaret. The world might be full of unscrupulous folk, but they often leave a trail as distinctive as a perfume signature from behind them." Dr. Brooks let out a thoughtful hum. Martin Lowe, arms folded, stood near the door like a vigilant sentry. No one spoke for a moment, each lost in personal speculation. In the silence, Agatha lowered herself to inspect the broken lock. She gave a slight tilt of her head as if to appraise every scratch and indentation. One might imagine her expression to be merely curious, but a faint flicker in her eyes suggested a deeper calculation, the start of invisible lines connecting a half-formed puzzle in her mind. At last, Agatha rose, dusted her hands and surveyed the grim evidence with measured calm. "It may appear a senseless theft," she observed in a tone laced with dry irony, "but in my experience such acts rarely prove random. I suspect someone wants more than a trophy for sabotage. We must find out who and precisely why." Margaret, looking as if she might crumple under the weight of her distress, managed a small nod. The shape of her despair filled the storeroom much as the spilled salt coated the floor. It was a scene of silent violation, of cunning opportunism. Outside, the sun dipped further beyond the horizon, casting a dusky glow through the high windows of the inn tucked away. In this storeroom the thick atmosphere of hidden motives pressed in upon them without warning. A gust of wind rattled the nearby shutters, and everyone present felt the faintest tremor of unease, as though the old building itself sensed the onset of a dark unraveling. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her temple. "What might do," she whispered. And Agatha Marple, aware that the shadows of greed, jealousy and fear had quietly fallen over Dunford, offered the only reassurance she could. "We shall discover the truth, Margaret," she said gently. "One must simply know where and how to look." A hush spread through the storeroom in the aftermath of Margaret's discovery, as though the very walls of the old Lantern Inn conspired to hold their breath. The spill of salt glinted in the lamplight, defying anyone to dismiss the sabotage as trivial. Outside, a lingering dust gave way to early evening, and the wind sent a fora creak along the eaves. It was only when Dr. Edwin Brooks knelt down, his keen gaze sweeping the floorboards, that he spotted the small scrap of parchment half tucked behind an overturned tin of cinnamon. With care, he lifted it as though it might crumble in his hand. "Margaret," he murmured, his voice betraying both curiosity and concern. "Look here." Agatha Marple, standing at the threshold with Lucy Spencer and Martin Lowe, drew nearer. A single line of crudely scrolled text ran across the parchment. "I'll make sure you don't win." A shallow intake of breath passed from Lucy to Margaret. The younger woman's eyes flashed with alarm. "So it isn't merely the recipe book," Lucy said in a tight whisper. "Someone wants to thwart Margaret's chances at the bake-off entirely." Margaret Carter clutched the edges of her apron. "This note, it's so personal. Who would wish me such ill will?" She appeared lost between disbelief and an anxiety that threatened to spill over at any moment. Agatha stepped forward, glancing briefly at the tattered edges of the parchment. Her silver hair, neatly pined, wind glimmered in the lamplight. She spoke in that measured, thoughtful tone so characteristic of her. If it were a simple theft, the culprit might have taken the book and left. But this smear of salt, the smashed container, it suggests a certain deliberation. Dr. Brooks nodded in agreement. "Indeed, whoever did this seemed determined to ruin your supplies in the process." Lucy's brow furrowed. "You think it's a competitor?" She glanced around as though expecting a masked figure to lurk in the storerooms. Shadows, after all. The bake-off does attract, well, some passionate contenders. Martin Lowe, who so often kept his thoughts behind a polite reserve, let out a small hum. Passion, jealousy. Those are potent forces, especially when prestige and money enter the equation. His words lingered in the cold air, a subtle echo of how the war had taught him to anticipate foul play in even the calmest of places. Margaret, struggling to maintain composure, raised her chin. "I've been baking for that festival for years. Never an incident like this. Nobody's resented me enough to sabotage my livelihood." Her voice faltered. Agatha placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's arm. "Fear and ambition can twist the most ordinary people," she said quietly. Then a wry hint of Dr. Dryness touched her tone. "Besides, Dunford is hardly the sleepy hamlet. It appears particularly when the stakes grow high. A muted silence followed, as if each member of the Friday night club momentarily questioned their own innocence or recollected someone else's small grudges. The wooden walls, once proud vestiges of a noble hunting estate, seemed to loom closer, as though they yearned to whisper secrets of past intrigues. At length Dr. Brooks cleared his throat. "What do you suggest we do now, Miss Marple?" Agatha's gaze flickered from the note to the spilled salt, and then to the broken lock on the storeroom cabinet. "I suggest we collect ourselves and proceed carefully. Let us set aside assumptions until we can examine every angle. Rushing to conclusions can be as damaging as a thief in the night." Margaret exhaled. Steeling herself, she moved to the door, her footsteps leaving faint impressions in the salt behind her. "I'll see to clearing up this mess in the meantime," she said, mustering a bravado that did not quite reach her eyes as they exited the storeroom. The note still clutched in Agatha's gloved hand. A late autumn chill wound its way down the corridor, slipping through the inn's aging timbers. It spoke of a subtle menace growing in the heart of Dunford, a reminder that secrets seldom remain silent for long. And as each member of the Friday night club retreated into their own thoughts, the riddle of the missing recipe book became less a matter of petty theft and more an urgent puzzle waiting to be solved outside. The last hint of twilight succumbed to moonlit shadows, laying a ghostly sheen across the village green within the once grand confines of the old Lantern Inn. Agatha Marple cast a contemplative glance at the cryptic note. There was far more to this than mere sabotage, and she knew, beneath the veneer of civility and the gentle hum of teapots, motives deeper and darker were beginning to stir. By early morning a pallid sun struggled to pierce the autumn fog enveloping the village of Dunford. Narrow cobblestone lanes lay half submerged in a pearly mist that clung to stone walls and the eaves of half-timbered cottages. Only the steeple of the centuries-old church rose above the swirling haze, a silent sentinel watching over the villages within the old Lantern Inn. A lodge once owned by a minor baronet's lamp lights still glowed behind leaded windows, revealing the silhouettes of early risers preparing for the day. Nestled in the inn's snug parlour sat the nucleus of Dunford's most unlikely investigative cohort. The Friday night club. They had gathered here not for idle chit-chat, although that too was inevitable, but to exchange what new insights they might glean regarding the theft of Margaret Carter's prized recipe book. Truth be told, few in the village suspected the quiet assembly of neighbors to be capable detectives, but beneath their mild exteriors lay keen minds unafraid of challenging questions. Agatha Marple, presiding over a tray of teacups and scone, was Agatha Marple, the gentle force around which the Friday night club revolved. Once a librarian accustomed to cataloguing countless volumes with meticulous diligence, she had an uncanny knack for perceiving patterns where others saw only coincidences. She was a woman in her early 60s, silver hair pinned neatly above clear grey eyes. The parlour amber light highlighted the fine lines of her face, each a silent testament to years spent observing rather than intruding. She now directed a thoughtful gaze at the cup in her hand. Agatha often found tea an excellent companion to reflection. It provided just enough pause to weigh observations with measured calm. Leaning back in a slightly creaking armchair, she recalled the stolen recipe book and the malicious note discovered the previous night. "I'll make sure you don't win it." Still rattled at the edges of her mind, she found herself contemplating not for the first time how jealousy could burrow itself deep into human nature. The faint clink of a teacup against its saucer brought her back to the present moment. Dr. Edward Wynne Brooks. Across from her, perched on a sturdy wooden chair, sat Dr. Edwin Brooks, a genial man in his late 40s whose broad smile and sonorous voice often enlivened any gathering. The son of a seamstress and a traveling salesman, he had earned a modest but secure standing as the village's doctor, a role he approached with equal parts dedication and theatrical flair. The good doctor's eyes sparkled with curiosity as he recounted rather animatedly one of his latest patients, who had insisted that a common cold was the dreaded influenza. "I dare say," he exclaimed with playful exasperation, "people do so love to imagine the worst. A simple cough when they see themselves consigned to the sick bed for weeks." A wry grin tugged at Agatha's lips. "One must be grateful you're here to set them straight." Bo chuckled. "Well, one tries," although he leaned forward, voice dropping in conspiratorial amusement. "I might have embellished the story a bit. No harm done, merely keeps the conversation lively." He flashed a disarming smile which Agatha knew well, signaled his ponent for exaggeration. Still, she privately considered that beneath his genial chatter ran a sharp intellect, capable of noting small details his patients might not think to hide. She had seen more than once how his doctor's instincts uncovered truths that ordinary folk often overlooked. Lucy Spencer, seated near a tall window sipping fragrant tea and gazing at the mist-shrouded village, was Lucy Spencer, only recently returned from an assignment in distant Morocco. She carried a faint air of worldliness about her. The discreet jingling of silver bracelets on her wrist, and the embroidered shawl draped over her shoulders hinted at the exotic locals she had visited. "Nothing compares to Dunford's crisp mornings," she remarked with a wistful smile. "I confess I do miss the smell of spice markets and orange blossoms. The world beyond is both marvelous and dangerous, but I never forget the solace of home." Brooks regarded her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "That's sure Lucy Moroccan. Is it one of your souvenir? I take it." Lucy nodded. "A gift from a Berber woman who guided me through a narrow pass in the Atlas Mountains. She told me that every stitch carried a blessing for safe travels." Agatha studied Lucy over the rim of her teacup. An adventurous soul in a traditionally quiet village was bound to provoke speculation, yet Lucy's open manner made her difficult to distrust. Still, Agatha suspected that Lucy, like many in Dunford, might be harboring secrets of her own. Travel journalism was a curious profession for a young woman with an earnest gaze and a taste for curiosity. Where might a longing for excitement lead someone when money or pride were at stake? Shared purpose and hidden threads. Dunford, with its rolling green pastures and ivy-clad cottages, had always worn the mask of quiet simplicity. It was a place where the biggest scandals often revolved around whose dahlias had won the village fair, or which butcher had raised the finest cuts for Sunday roasts. And yet, beneath this quaint charm something darker stirred. A stolen recipe book might have seemed like mere village gossip at first, an unfortunate inconvenience, a momentary scandal, but to Agatha Marple the theft was no impulsive act. It was deliberate, calculated, a move on a chessboard where the stakes were far higher than they appeared. The fire in the old Lantern Inn crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the polished oak table where Agatha and her companions sat. A hush had settled over them, the air thick with speculation and unspoken tension. Then Agatha leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp beneath the soft glow of the gas lamp. "We must ask ourselves," she said, her voice calm yet weighted with meaning, "who stands to gain the most from Margaret's misfortune?" The others instinctively drew closer. Her words were not a mere question, they were a challenge, a dare to see past the obvious and into the hidden depths of motive and opportunity. "The bake-off is approaching," she continued, her gaze sweeping over them, "and with it comes not only prestige but also financial gain, at least in philanthropic terms. A thief rarely acts without purpose. Could it be a competitor, someone who sees Margaret as an obstacle?" Lucy Spencer, ever the skeptic, glanced at the window where tendrils of fog curled against the glass like ghostly fingers. "Surely you're not suggesting an outsider, a stranger, would come all the way to Dunford just to sabotage her? That seems a bit far-fetched." Dr. Brooks, the genial yet ever thoughtful physician, tapped a finger against his chin. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but we mustn't dismiss the possibility of a hired hand. Rivalries in these events can be fierce. Someone who has lost before, someone with a grudge, might see this as their only chance to tip the scales in their favor. Agatha let silence settle between them, knowing that in moments of quiet, people often revealed more than they intended. Then, after a deliberate pause, she set down her teacup with the faintest clink against the saucer. "There is another angle," she murmured, watching their expressions carefully. "What if this isn't about winning at all? What if it's about the money?" A subtle shift ran through the group. Even the steady glow of the fire seemed to flicker in response. "What do you mean?" Lucy asked, her brow furrowing. Agatha's fingers lightly traced the rim of her cup. Margaret planned to donate the prize money to charity. But what if someone else had other ideas? A competing cause, a rival institution, the kind of place that might struggle to keep its doors open if the donation went elsewhere. At this, Dr. Brooks' usually genial face darkened, his brow creasing with something that looked almost like recognition. He was widely known to support a struggling clinic in a neighboring town, one that was always in dire need of funding. If Margaret's winnings were pledged to another charity, someone connected to that clinic, or one like it, might not take kindly to losing such an opportunity. The realization settled over them like a sudden drop in temperature. Agatha observed Dr. Brooks carefully but said nothing. "Not yet." Lucy exhaled slowly, folding her arms as she stared down at the tabletop. "I only hope," she said at last, "that the culprit isn't someone close to us." A heavy silence followed. The idea of betrayal of someone within their own trusted circle having a hand in this was almost too bitter to consider. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the skeletal outlines of tall poplar trees swaying along the cobbled main street. But inside, the fog of suspicion remained, thick and suffocating. It clung to the walls, wrapped itself around them like an unseen force, whispering that the answers they sought were not in the darkness beyond the windows, but sitting among them. As the three companions rose from their seats, their glances were not merely determined, they were wary. This was no longer just an intriguing mystery, this was a battle for truth, and as Agatha Marple well knew, the most dangerous truths were always the ones hidden in plain sight, and trust in a tightly KCK community. The old lantern creaked gently, almost in agreement below them. The murmur of Margaret Carter's employees setting tables for the lunch crowd filtered through the floorboards. Dr. Brooks straightened his coat. He said with the genial air of a gentleman presenting a proposition, "Believe a thorough conversation with Margaret might be in order. Perhaps she's recalled some small detail she overlooked in the shock of last night." Lucy gathered her embroidered shawl around her shoulders and nodded. "I'll speak with a few shopkeepers. I know, though, it's the meest hunch they might have." Noticed strangers lurking about. Agatha offered a mild smile. "Excellent thinking, Lucy, and do remember apparently trivial observations often prove the most revealing." Her grey eyes glinted with an almost imperceptible wryness, a spark of dry wit that surfaced whenever a fresh puzzle piqued her interest. "After all," she added quietly, "sometimes the greatest secrets are hidden by the most ordinary facade." And so they prepared to set out into the hush of a 1920s Dunford morning. Agatha, with her calm deliberation, Dr. Brooks with his eager curiosity, and Lucy with her worldly charm, each would uncover new threads and possibly new suspects. They could not have guessed just how tangled the web of motivations ran beneath Dunford's placid surface, nor how heavily the threat of sabotage would weigh on them all. Yet they pressed on, united in their quiet vow to shine light on what lurked in the shadows. And as the door to the parlor clicked shut behind them, the old lantern seemed to sigh, its timbered walls settling into uneasy silence, patiently awaiting the unfolding of secrets that had only begun to. A languid morning sun cast long shadows across the stone-paved courtyard of the old lantern, lending a fleeting warmth to the crisp autumn air. Already the hush of dawn had given way to the sounds of preparation within. Pots clinked in the kitchens, chairs scraped across flagstones in the dining area, and muffled footsteps moved up and down the winding corridors for a grand Building originally intended as a hunting retreat for minor nobility, the inn now seemed both stately and faintly claustrophobic, like a faded dower clinging to past glories, yet filled with unseen dramas in every corner. In the snug parlour at the back of the inn stood two figures outwardly dissimilar, but bound by recent events. One was Margaret Carter, mistress of this venerable establishment and victim of the recent theft. The other was Martin Lowe, the quiet newcomer, whose polite reserve stirred much curiosity around Donard. Both for different reasons were at the heart of the puzzle that had sent the village's comfortable routine into disarray. Margaret Carter, the warm-hearted owner. Margaret Carter's presence seemed to fill the parlour with reassuring solidity. She was neither young nor old. One might place her in her early 50s, and carried herself with practical efficiency. Friendly brown eyes, lightly creased at the corners, contrasted with the deeper lines of worry now etched across her brow. Her auburn hair, starting to show strands of silver, was tucked into a neat twist, and she wore a plain yet elegant day dress, suitable for managing the inn. Having discovered her recipe book stolen and her storeroom sabotaged, Margaret had spent a restless night, torn between hurt and indignation. Yet even now her posture remained steadfast, as though no calamity could truly undermine her sense of duty to her patrons. Anyone who had known her over the years would say that Margaret Carter embodied the Old Lantern's spirit. Stalwart, generous and unerringly loyal, she stood by a mahogany sideboard, methodically arranging cups and saucers for the day's first customers. The parlour high-beam ceiling and carved wainscoting offered a gentile reminder of the inn's genteel origins, yet the atmosphere felt subdued by the aftermath of the burglary. She glanced up at the tall windows where sunlight strove to penetrate the heavy brocade curtains. "Perhaps I should leave them open wider," she murmured, half to herself, half to Martin, to let in a bit of light. "I'd hate for my inn to look as gloomy as I feel." Martin Lowe, the reserve newcomer, leaning quietly against the doorframe. Martin Lowe inclined his head in agreement, a trim man in his early 40s, with close-cropped dark hair peppered at the temples. He wore a tailored but mod tweed jacket, a garment that spoke more of function than fashion. A rumor had it he had served in military intelligence during the Great War. Though no one could confirm the details, he offered few hints himself deftly, sidestepping curiosity with polite half-answers. His air of understated confidence, combined with a certain stillness of demeanor, made villagers uncertain whether to view him as an intriguing presence or a potential threat. Some speculated he had come to Deptford on undisclosed business. Others believed he merely sought the quiet life now, as the theft cast suspicion in all directions. Martin found himself watched more closely than he might have wished. He moved away from the door, stepping into a rectangle of sunlight that lit dust motes dancing around him. "Gloom doesn't suit you, Mrs. Carter," he said, voice calm, "though I understand how distressing this must be." Margaret exhaled sharply. "It's the bake-off that troubles me most. Not because of my pride, you see, but the donation. If I fail to present my best dish, this precious little chance of winning, and that money, well, it was promised to a cause very dear to my heart." Martin's dark eyes flickered with sympathy. "I imagine it must be no small sum." She nodded, tightening her grip on a cup, before placing it gently with the others. "Substantial enough to matter. Whoever did this must have known what it would cost me financially. Yes, but also personally." A moment's silence, settled, broken only by the faint hum of voices in the corridor. The inn's staff bustled about, but a heavy hush hovered in the parlour, as though the old walls themselves listened. Quiet interplay of motives seemingly from nowhere. Agatha Marple appeared at the threshold. She glided inside with a serene composure, her silver hair pinned neatly, a mild smile playing around her lips. One could almost miss her entrance, so soft was her tread. Yet Martin and Margaret both turned to greet her, sensing her quiet authority. "Agatha," Margaret said, relief quickening her tone, "I was just feeling terribly out of sorts. Have you discovered anything yet?" Agatha offered a small sympathetic tilt of her head. One hardly uncovers a culprit overnight, my dear, but fresh perspectives and gentle questions often illuminate hidden corners. I thought I might see how you're faring. Martin folded his arms unconsciously, adopting the stance of a man accustomed to observation. They say you have quite a knack for these affairs, Miss Marple, he said, in a polite, measured voice. Any immediate suspicions? Agatha regarded him with kind but penetrating eyes. I prefer not to trade in suspicions. Mr. Lofax, on the other hand, can be surprisingly resilient. When confronted with patience, a faint curve touched his mouth, though his posture remained guarded. An excellent approach. Ma set down the final cup with a decisive click. Well, if you ask me, it's likely one of my rivals for the bake-off, Anne Hathaway, is a possibility. She's forever lamenting my unfair advantage, and that traveling pastry chef from up north looked rather envious of my recipes last year. She paused, her features clouding. But then again, could it be someone from here in Dunford? Someone I trust? At that, Martin's eyes strayed to the sash window as though recalling a conversation or memory. Unspoken. Agatha watched him in her peripheral vision, noting a subtle tension in the set of his shoulders. Was that concern, or simply a pang of sympathy? Agatha smoothed her skirt with an absent gesture. There might be a dozen plausible motives, she said, calmly, arranging from jealousy to pure spite. We should keep open minds. I suspect there's far more to unravel them. We see now seeds of misdirection. Margaret sighed. I just want my recipes back, or at least the chance to recreate them properly before the festival. Whoever's behind this is callous indeed. Martin lowered his voice, offering quiet reassurance. We'll help you, Mrs. Carter. I'm sure the rest of the Friday night club feels the same. This community stands by its own. Agatha noted his phrasing, this community, a subtle distinction from our or my, perhaps underscoring his status as an outsider, but she simply smiled, letting the silence expand before steering the conversation to the details of Margaret's routine. On the night of the theft, it was in these everyday recollections, when hearts softened to speak of small overlooked matters, that the most telling insights often emerge. Margaret recounted the day's events, preparing dough in the early afternoon, greeting a handful of travelers who checked into the inn, and locking her storeroom before retiring for the evening. Martin listened with the polite attention of someone well trained in leaning intelligence. Agatha quietly asked about any unusual deliveries or persons loitering about. The dialogue's rhythmic back and forth seemed ordinary enough until Margaret recalled a perplexing detail about a door left slightly ajar in the store corridor. You're certain you secured it? Agatha prompted, her voice mild yet intent. Yes, Margaret insisted I never leave that door unlocked, but after the theft it was ajar. Martin's gaze flicked briefly toward the corridor, a detail worth noting. Agatha's eyes glinted with a ripple of wry amusement. As I said, facts can prove most instructive. A tense atmosphere grows. Footsteps in the hall signaled the arrival of a maid, setting up for luncheon service. The old Lantern's main dining room, sumptuous in oak paneling and stained glass, would soon fill with chattering patrons, who remained blissfully unaware of the mysteries brewing under their very noses. Yet a sense of unease hung in the parlor, accentuated by the muffled clang of pots from the kitchens below. Margaret, fighting the weight of worry, mustered a resolute air. I'll manage, she declared, rallying her warm non-nonsense temperament. It isn't in my nature to fret too long. The bake-off is only days away. I must adjust my plans if I'm to have any chance at competing. Agatha inclined her head, affording Margaret a gentle smile. And we will do our part to see you through. Rest assured. Martin gave a concise nod. Count on it, Mrs. Carter. A quiet hush returned as Margaret excused herself to meet with her staff. Agatha and Martin lingered in the parlor, hushed, their reflections caught in a large gilt-framed mirror that had once belonged to a noble family outside the sun's tentative glow, illuminated the inn's courtyard. Somewhere a rooster crowed late in greeting. The day Agatha broke the silence with a soft observation. "You're quite determined to help Margaret, Mr. Lowe. I find that admirable." He held her gaze, neither flinching nor rushing to fill the silence. "Everyone deserves a fair chance, Miss Marple," he said at length, "especially in a village so fond of tradition." She allowed a small enigmatic smile, the kind that conveyed understanding without revealing her thoughts. Indeed, and so the stage was set. Two watchers, each skilled in reading the unspoken, now drawn deeper into the tapestry of ambition, resentment and hidden alliances that stretched across Dunford. The Old Lantern, in once a place of restful hospitality, had become a crucible for revealing the darker impulses that simmer under the surface of quiet village life in the spreading daylight. The parlor shadows receded, yet the questions remain: who had dared cross Margaret Carter, and why risk sabotage that harmed both her and her beloved charity cause? What secrets lay in Martin Lowe's past, and why had he chosen to settle here now? Of all times, above all, how would these seemingly innocent threads weave together into a pattern of motives that could only be unraveled by a keen eye and a patient heart? A moral intended to find out. A languid haze of midday sun settled over the village of Dunford, softening the gabled rooftops into gentle outlines. The previous evening's apprehension, triggered by the theft of Margaret Carter's recipe book, lingered in the air. Like a faint bitter perfume, people spoke in hushed tones, eyes drifting toward the Old Lantern, in as though it had become the stage for a curious drama inside the inn's snug sitting room. Agatha Marple took her customary seat, the warm glow of the fireplace accentuating the light silver of her neatly pinned hair. Opposite her, Lucy Spencer reclined on a worn velvet settee, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. She toyed with a small leather-bound notebook, an artifact of her far-flung travels, and the subtle tension in her posture suggested she had a pressing story to tell. Dowling Brooks, spirited as ever, soon joined them with the buoyant energy of a man accustomed to brightening convalescent rooms. "Don't mind if I indulge in a cup, do you?" he asked, eyeing the teapot. He poured a measure and settled beside Agatha, who gave a gracious nod in reply. They were expecting Martin Lowe shortly. Ever discreet, the man had offered to check on any suspicious comings and goings at the livery stable, yet conversation soon gravitated to Margaret Carter. The inn's proprietor, Lucy's hazel eyes sparkled with uneasy curiosity. "Margaret's victories at the bake-off, winning thrice in a row, isn't that somewhat unprecedented for a village competition?" Dr. Brooks chuckled, a low, affable sound. "She's skilled, no question about that, and she knows exactly how to charm the judges. It hasn't endeared her to the other contestants. Mind you, some have lost to her more than once." Agatha, stirring her tea, offered a gentle observation. "If envy or wounded pride are at play, the sabotage might have been a convenient way to unseat her from her pedestal. Greed and jealousy often wear the most ordinary faces." Before Lucy could reply, Martin Lowe entered, moving with quiet precision. A draught of cool air followed him, as though he carried the crisp autumn day indoors in his tweed coat. His nod was polite, yet a flicker in his dark eyes suggested he had picked up more rumors than he cared to share. "Outright, you were speaking of Margaret's rivals." "Yes," Martin said by way of greeting. He hung his coat on the hat stand. "I've heard talk of Anne Hathaway complaining that Margaret's pies always seem to coincidentally match the judges' tastes, and as that traveling pastry chef from far, Mr. T.R., I believe, who once declared Margaret's victory a triumph of local bias." Lucy's gaze flitted between them. "Which makes either of them potential suspects, wouldn't you say?" Dr. Brooks shrugged lightly. "The question is whether sour grapes alone suffice to commit theft and sabotage." He sipped his tea, voice turning thoughtful. And remember, anyone with a reason to direct this year's charitable donation elsewhere might feel compelled to scupper. Margaret's chances. A moment's hush ensued, briefly broken by footsteps in the corridor. Then Lucy cleared her throat, clasping her notebook. This might sound unusual, but during my last trip abroad, I stumbled on something personal about someone here in Danford. She hesitated as though weighing how much to disclose. I can't quite say who yet, she continued, but it made me realize not everyone is as they seem. She cast a brief glance at Martin, who stiffened almost imperceptibly. Agatha, observing the minute shift in his took note with silent precision. Dr. Brooks, ever inquisitive, leaned forward. Dare we ask for any hint at all? Lucy offered a coy smile. Let's just say a villager's name came up in a most unexpected place. I'm not certain yet whether it's relevant to Margaret's recipe book being stolen, but it caught me off guard. Martin looked as though he might interject, but instead he pressed his lips together. Agatha's gaze flicked between them, perceiving a subtle current of tension, a bristle of unsaid truth. The air felt charged in the small sitting room, the carved paneling and thick drapes heightening an almost claustrophobic sense that secrets hovered just out of reach. Agatha then spoke with a mild humor that masked her sharper insights. Lucy, my dear, you do have a flair for dramatic timing. One hopes this local person won't mind your discovery should it surface at the wrong moment. Lucy's cheeks darkened a shade. Martin busied himself adjusting a cufflink. Silence stretched for a moment. The only sounds were the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen and the faint rustle of the wind beyond the window. Dr. Brooks finally broke the hush with a genial chuckle. Enough cloak and dagger for the morning. I say, how about a practical approach? I'll see if any of my patients have noticed odd behavior among neighbors or traveling salesmen. Folks tend to confide in their doctor. Martin nodded, recovering his composure. And I can make discreet inquiries too. He offered his tone. Even this might simply be a disgruntled competitor, but if Lucy's discovery links back to our Sabbath, well, the bake-off may not be the only motive at play. Agatha sat back, a thoughtful expression on her face. She lifted her teacup, its porcelain rim catching a shaft of sunlight in an almost mocking gleam. Yes, indeed, it appears Dunford is brimming with motivations, rivalries, concealed identities, ambitions. One wonders how many of these threads must come together before we can see a tapestry of truth outside. The wind sighed through the narrow streets, tossing golden leaves against the windows. Yet the real storms, it seemed, brewed within the hearts of these quietly scheming villagers, hearts that carried pride, fear, and longing. And as Lucy's revelations settled into the unspoken tension, Agatha Marple could not help but suspect that the puzzle lay far deeper than a mere spat over recipes and ribbons. A languid September sun beamed over Dunford's winding lanes, casting a golden hue upon the moss-covered stone walls and stained glass windows of the village's old church. The customary bustle of market day filled the crisp air with chatter, yet an undercurrent of restlessness threaded through the crowd. Margaret Carter's stolen recipe book continued to dominate local gossip, whispered in corners and over cups of tea behind the heavy doors of the old Lantern Inn. Agatha Marple strolled into the small private lounge where Dr. Edwin Brooks stood by the mullen window. Dust motes danced in a beam of later afternoon light behind him, creating the illusion of a spotlight trained upon the amiable, ever-smiling physician. A faint frown lined his Miss Marple, Dr. Brooks said, catching sight of her approach. He gave a cordial nod, though his hand remained clasped behind his back, a display of tension perhaps, or a sign of suppressed worry. Have you heard that Mrs. Burton down on Maple Street insists she saw a stranger lurking about last night? She'd only revealed that much to me. I'm afraid so. I took the liberty of speaking to her father. The story is, well, quite vague. Vagueness can hold surprising truths. Dr. Agatha replied, her voice gentle yet laced with a subtle dryness. But how is it you seem so agitated?" He shifted his feet, gazing out at the afternoon throng of villagers. "It's merely the bake-off. I have a personal stake of sorts. My name, after all, is tied to the local clinic. I sponsor. If someone other than Margaret Carter wins, the charitable donation would be directed to my clinic." Agatha's grey eyes reflected a soft empathy. She knew that Dr. Brooks treated many of Dunford's poorer residents at little or no charge. Still, such altruism could blend uneasily with ambition, if one's own cause stood to benefit from an unexpected upset. Their conversation was interrupted by Lucy Spencer stepping into the lounge with that brisk confidence that marked her a woman of the world. It newly home from her travels, Dr. Miss Marple. Lucy greeted, halting when she caught Dr. Brooks's uncharacteristic air of disquiet. "Am I intruding?" No, dear Lucy," Dr. Brooks replied with a practiced geniality of a man pushing aside his anxieties. "We're merely discussing the bake-off. Seems the stakes have never been higher." Lucy lowered herself onto a chaise, dropping her satchel of notes at her feet. "Indeed, with Margaret's recipes missing, even the most ordinary participants might fancy their chances, and if Margaret's entry is sabotaged, well, with Saul's our fusion trailed off into the hush of the lounge. Thick tapestries on the walls lent a claustrophobic sense of enclosure, recalling the old lantern's past as a hunting retreat. One almost expected to glimpse the ghost of some minor aristocrat prowling the corridors. Agatha placed a thoughtful hand against her chin. The trouble with a large donation is that it makes victory tempting, for all ambition in these matters can overshadow neighborly spirit. Her kindly gaze drifted to Dr. Brooks, though her tone remained measured. "You did say you stand to benefit if Margaret doesn't win." He let out a soft sigh. "I'd be lying if I said it didn't matter to me. But sabotage, theft, I would never condone such things." A fleeting hardness crept into his voice before it receded. "It is my hope that the rightful victor, whomever that may be, earns success honestly." Lucy's hazel eyes, a recipe for discord. Curiosity flickered in Lucy Spencer's hazel eyes, though there was a shadow of unease beneath it. "You've often pointed out," she mused, "how trifles can become momentous in a small village where resources are scarce and reputations fragile." "Precisely," Agatha Marple murmured, her voice soft yet weighted. "The difference between a minor quarrel and a full-blown crime is often thinner than we'd like to admit." For a moment silence settled between them, thick as the gathering dusk outside. From beyond the heavy wooden doors of the lounge, the cheerful hum of the inn's common room drifted in. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of conversation. Life carried on, oblivious to the storm that brewed beneath its surface. Outside, the village bustled as it always did, farmers hauling crates of fresh produce to market, schoolchildren shrieking in delight as they darted between carts, merchants calling out their wares of lace and ribbons. Yet here, within the dim hush of the lounge, the air was heavy with something unseen, a tension that pressed in like the thick ornate tapestries lining the walls. Lucy shifted, her voice cautious as she glanced at Dr. Brooks. "You mentioned a rumor about a stranger in town. Do you think it might be connected?" Dr. Brooks hesitated, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his teacup, worry tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Mrs. Burton is prone to exaggeration," he admitted at last, "but yes. She insists she saw a man in a dark coat skulking near the inn's back entrance 2 nights ago." He exhaled, shaking his head. "Truthfully, it may be nothing, or it may be everything." Agatha tilted her head slightly, watching him, measuring his words. A man in a dark coat, skulking, near the inn. Coincidence had never been something she put much stock in. Her gaze flickered across the room, absorbing everything, the flickering lamplight, the shadows pooling in corners, the flicker of uncertainty in Dr. Brooks' eyes, the bake-off and its grand charitable donation. had quietly become more than just a friendly contest. It was a stake of pride, ambition, and perhaps even desperation. And where desperation took root, motives were seldom as innocent as they first appeared. Eventually, the trio drifted into the corridor, parting ways with polite words and composed smiles. But behind those smiles, unspoken questions lingered. Agatha's mind turned over the pieces, fitting them together in ways yet unseen. Alone now, she moved down the dimly lit corridor of the Old Lantern Inn, her footfalls muffled by the plush carpet. The inn, with its lingering echoes of aristocratic grandeur, seemed to close in around her, as though the very walls sensed the unease threading through Dunford. Chandeliers overhead swayed slightly, as a draught whispered through the hall, a cold breath against her neck. For all its rustic charm, Dunford had become a place where tensions simmered just beneath the surface. The bake-off was meant to be a celebration, but now it felt like something else entirely. Money, pride, reputations, each was a powerful motivator on its own. But together they formed a volatile mix, a recipe for discord that, if left to stew for too long, might yet boil over in the most unexpected and dangerous of ways. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent, dipping toward the horizon in a wash of burnished gold and deepening amber. The fields beyond the village glowed in the fading light, casting long stretched shadows. Somewhere in those shadows, Agatha knew, lay the truth, and she intended to find it.